Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video we're looking at Stalin and the economy up until 1941. We'll deal with the later part later on in this series when we look at the war years, and then we'll go on to the end of Stalin onto Khrushchev. So in this one we're particularly looking at economic policies in terms of the 5-year plans and collectivization. Now this is a really important point in the development of the Russian economy, and it's going to be interesting to contrast what Stalin does to what had been done by Lenin before him. We're going to be looking at elements such as how socialist these policies are, as well as how successful they are. In success is quite a delicate and difficult thing to look at, because yes, there are facts and figures, assuming they are facts, about the degree of success in development of industry, but there's also a huge amount of stuff about the terrible human cost of what was carried out under Stalin. What is undoubtedly true is that the Soviet Union was far greater an industrial power in 1941 than it had been in the late 1920s when Stalin had come to power. So, as I said earlier, it's important to reflect on what happened before. And actually, the chances are, if you ask a question on this period, it is likely to involve the economic policies of Lenin and Stalin together, to cover that period 1917 through to 1941. There is a previous video in the series that looks at Lenin's economic policy, so this is just a bit of a reminder. So he had state capitalism. In this, Lenin accepted the peasants seizing control of the land and the workers seizing control of the factories. I mean, there are links to his April thesis, but he didn't actively give them the land and actively give them the factories. They kind of took them all themselves. And he went, yeah, that's fine. Now, the policy attempted a form of state-led capitalism because Lenin believed, quite correctly, that Russia had not gone through the capitalist epoch, and that what he said was that it needed to. So following his Marxist principles, he said, well, actually we need to go through some form of the capitalist epoch before socialism can be achieved. So we'll run some kind of state-controlled capitalism. This didn't work. I mean, partly or largely due to the context of the Civil War. So we then get war communism. And this fed on from state capitalism, which wasn't working, and there was all kinds of problems with it. With essentially, if you took all the managers out of the factories didn't work very well, and uncontrolled pay rises and all kind of things like that. One of the key bits of war communism was the requisition squads being sent out to requisition crops to feed the soldiers and workers to keep the Bolshevik war effort going. The policy failed very dramatically. It led to massive famine and even outbreaks of cannibalism. So war communism, a very brutal policy, part of a very brutal bit of Russian history. War communism was followed by the NEP. Now the NEP or the New Economic Policy, was the brainchild of Bukharin, and it saw the establishment of a capitalist economy, essentially, to encourage production of food, and it proved successful. Grain production increased very dramatically. There was some issues such as the scissor crisis, when production of consumer goods failed to keep pace with other successors, which then led to a drop in food production, because essentially there was nothing for successful peasants to buy. The NEP, however, was quite strongly criticised because it was seen as abandoning communist principles. And again, if you go back to the video on the factions and the competition to take over from Lenin, then this all plays a big part in this, with Stalin swapping sides and backing the left and then backing the right, and all the stuff with his route to power. So the New Economic Policy was probably the most successful, definitely was the most successful of Lenin's economic policies, but was also the least socialist. Now, as we get towards the end of the 1920s, then Stalin starts to argue against the NEP, having previously supported it, and argues that it must come to an end. And there were a multitude of issues that he highlighted in this. There was a high level of taxation on the peasants, which was leading to problems. The peasants were hiding their grain and their animals from authorities to avoid paying tax. In 27, the government only collected 80% of the revenue that it expected to. The peasants stopped cultivating as much land due to the high taxation, because it essentially, unless the land was highly productive, it wasn't worth the effort. And coupled with bad weather and poor harvests in 27, this led to what was known as the procurement crisis of 27-28, when the supply of grain to the cities dropped by 30%, causing, again, a massive problem. The problems of state-run heavy industry was deepening, so the NEP, again, he appeared to be not hugely effective. The party was worried about increased reports of antisocial behaviour amongst young people, and again, as Marxists, their assumption was that the capitalist elements of the NEP were encouraging selfish and decadent attitudes. So bourgeois attitudes were being brought about by the NEP, and the two kind of major groups they would pick out, and this would be the neep men, who were the kind of the middlemen who were making lots of money out of the NEP, and the kulaks, these rich peasants who were making lots of money. And so they started to say, well, this is going against our principles. And again, that'd be quite useful if you're writing an essay about how socialist were these policies, and this is quite a good way of saying, well, actually, the Communist Party itself, Stalin notably, was suddenly now raising issues going, I actually really don't think this policy does fit with our ideology. Now, Stalin proposed a change, and what he wanted was a rapid, centrally directed industrialization that was brought about through 5-year plans, which would set targets for industry and focus and plan what was happening with development of industry, and also with collectivization of agriculture. And a predominant concern of Stalin's was Russia's comparative weakness against the rest of the world. And he said, if you are backward and weak, then you may be beaten and enslaved, but if you are powerful, people must be aware of you. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make up this gap in 10 years. Either do this or they crush us. Now, again, history would prove, well, Stalin fairly correct in this, that there was this need to catch up, or they would have been crushed, and they definitely would have been crushed by Nazi Germany. And one of the ways we can judge success of Stalin's economic policy is the fact that they were able to hold off the Nazi attack. And we will see by the end of this period of 5-year plans and collectivization that Russia has caught up. It's caught up and probably overtaken the likes of Italy and maybe even Japan in terms of industrial output, and perhaps has even caught up with Britain. So we're going to see some fairly significant stuff in terms of what Stalin achieves. Now, the first 5-year plan, you will notice whenever you're studying this, only lasts for 4 years. So it's from October 28 through to December 32. It's kind of finally kind of rubber stamped and fully approved by the party conference in 29, but it started before that. Its aims included the maximum development of the means of production as the foundation of industrialization of the country, and Russia was to become an industrial rival to the West. Now, very, very ambitious targets were laid down to be reached within 5 years. For the Class A industry, the heavy industry, coal, iron, oil, machine building, then they were to triple their output, and this was to account for 80% of the total investment. This is really where the Soviet Union and Stalin's policy was going to focus. And then you've got your Class B industry, your consumer goods, and the aim was for them to double their output. And one thing we'll notice as we go through and evaluate this is that those Class B industries tend to always get forgotten. The big push is on the heavy industry, the coal, the iron, the oil, the machine, the electricity, the transport, stuff like that, and your consumer stuff always drags behind. So the first 5-year plan, well, there's an awful lot to kind of get your teeth into through this in terms of what happened. Well, electricity production trebled, coal and iron output doubled. You'll notice that they were supposed to treble, but they doubled. So yes, you can go they didn't meet their targets, but doubling your coal and iron production is still an impressive feat in 4 years. Still, production increased by 1/3, so it is going up. Again, you might kind of go, well, maybe that should be on the other side, because that's not tripled. Engineering industry developed an increasing output of machine tools, turbines, etc. And this is really important, because if you can build essentially your own factories, if you have the tools to make tools, if you have the machines to make machines, then essentially you can grow exponentially, and you're not reliant on other countries. Some huge new industrial complexes were built or being built, including new industrial towns, such as Magnitogorsk in the Urals, and these were kind of very impressive feats, where essentially you started with land which had nothing, and you built this great industrial city from nothing. So there was big progress there. So huge new tractor works were being built to meet the needs of agriculture. And the 5-year plan finished after 4, claiming great success. So you can see there were positives in it. However, there were also a great deal number of weaknesses in it. So there was very little growth, or even potentially a decline, in consumer industries such as house building, food processing, and textiles. Small workshops were squeezed out, partly because of the drive against the neat men, and partly because fuels and materials were diverted towards state-run enterprises. Chemical targets were not fulfilled. There was a lack of skilled workers, so the kind of technical education was not really in place, and so you'd still have this reliant on foreign experts. Transport was not developed sufficiently. I mean, there's all kinds of stories across the 5-year plans of tractor works building loads and loads of tractors, and then them just sitting by the side of the railway line waiting for eventually to be taken away in huge lots, and some stuff with crops rotting, waiting to be picked up, because there just wasn't the transport infrastructure built. I think probably the biggest problem with all of this is essentially, although we do see results, these results come out of a kind of chaos. Now, the idea of this was supposed to be centrally and very well planned, but actually what you've got in this atmosphere is fear that Stalin creates. So you've got managers that are so desperate to achieve their targets, they resorted to bribery, to false accounting, and then even illegally taking, so essentially stealing resources destined for other factories so they would meet their targets, because failure to meet your targets was actually a criminal offence. So and this starts to build in something that is an ongoing theme through the whole of the 5-year plans, is this idea of quantity over quality. So if you had to build so many thousand tractors, if you potentially were going to one of Stalin's prisons, if you didn't, then you built that number of tractors. Now, they might not all work. They might work for a bit and then break down. They may not be of the greatest quality, but that's not really your problem. Your bit is, I built the tractors, and then it'll be somebody else's problem later on, and they'll get into trouble when they break down. So there was lots of cutting of corners and lots of smokes and mirrors as well, really, to claim this as an overwhelming success. Now, the second 5-year plan ran from January 33 through to December 37. And again, we see a great deal of success in this. We see electricity production continues to grow very rapidly. Heavy industry benefited from the plants that had been set up in the first plan, and we see this such as some of the prestige projects that we called the Dnipro dam. I deeply apologise for all my Russian pronunciation, which I know is very, very shoddy. By 37, the USSR was virtually self-sufficient in machine making and metal working, which is really, really significant. Transport and communication grew rapidly, especially the railway, and again, one of these big prestige projects was the Moscow Underground system, which was just seen as an absolute phenomenon at the time. Chemical industry was now growing, so things like fertilizer production was increasing. Metallurgy developed, particularly in copper, zinc, and tin, and they were being mined for the first time.
There was some growth in consumer industries such as footwear production, bakeries, meat packing. So there was some good progress across the board in this. However, overall consumer goods were still lagging well behind the kind of focus and emphasis on core primary industries. Oil production had not quite made the advances it was hoped for, and again we see the USSR is trying to leap to keep up, because we're just about to, we're moving into the era of oil and steel rather than coal and iron, which is kind of being left behind. And we've got this issue of quantity over quality remained, and we've also got the fact that the 5-year plans are disrupted by the purges, because you've often got the people who are doing key things who are suddenly going to get purged out of the party and out of existence because of Stalin's fear of any form of opposition. So we're going, the purges across Stalinism cause enormous problems, because often at key moments of time he's got key individuals in place and then he just tears whole lines of management or lines of people in charge of stuff out, and doesn't have qualified people to replace them. It happens economically, we'll see it militarily as well. And linked to that, increasingly resources were being diverted into defence projects as tension grew across Europe and the world, and so we see the USR kind of concentrating on self-defense, and this all fits together with Stalin's idea of socialism in one country. And remember that quote I gave to you from him earlier. One of the main driving forces of his attempt to industrialize so rapidly was because he feared attack. So again, an economic historian looking at it might kind of go, well, this is a failure because actually you're not building consumer goods, you're not building enough of your heavy industry in the right way, because you're just concentrating on building arms, and it's economically, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. But if we're looking at what actually Stalin's aiming to achieve, then this is quite a significant part of what he's aiming to achieve, and therefore is important. So exactly where these fit in terms of strengths and weaknesses will partly depend on the question and in terms of the way you're looking at it. Now, the third 5-year plan is cut short, so it starts in January 38 and runs to June 41 for obvious reasons, with Operation Barbarossa in June 41. And we see the continued growth of heavy industry, and we see an enormous amount of money and effort being poured into defence and armaments, and again, the argument becomes a military one, really, about whether this is money and resources well spent, because although the early part of the war doesn't go well for the Soviet Union, then ultimately it is able to hold off, repel, and then push back the German armies, and therefore this can be held up as justified and successful. The third 5-year plan got to a really bad start with the very, very harsh winter at the beginning of 38. It was disrupted all the way through by the purges. Steel, which was one of the absolutely key industries at this point, particularly linking with our military stuff, output of steel was growing insignificantly. Again, another really key a key material at this point was oil, and oil production failed to meet its targets again. Consumer industry never, again, you keep on thinking, well, you build heavy industry, and then after you've done that, you'll be able to start building consumer industry. So maybe by the time you get to the third 5-year plan, consumer industry will start to see more emphasis and more success, but it doesn't, because the be all and all end up becomes defence. Factories run short of materials, and then they do, again, and this can be seen as a strategically very significant and a very good idea, is a lot of industry was moved from the vulnerable western parts of the Soviet Union to eastwards beyond the Urals, and this is going to be hugely important because it stops the Nazis ever getting control of it, but it does slow production, and it does cause massive disruption during this third 5-year plan. So economically nonsensical to suddenly uproot your industry and move it. Militarily and strategically maybe fairly sound. So to try and draw some conclusions about the 5-year plans, well, there was significant growth in heavy industry with a 4-fold increase in the production of steel, 6-fold increase in coal production. Massive advances were made in the generation of electricity, and the metal industries had largely been built up from scratch. Russia had caught up a great deal with Western powers in terms of industrial output, so outstripping a lot of parts of Western Europe, in particular countries like Italy, maybe France, and catching up with Britain. A Soviet state-run economy fitted with the communist ideology, and it arguably outperformed, or did outperform, the West in the 1930s that had been hit by the Great Depression. So on ideologically, you think, oh well, this actually, the 5-year plan, central planning, government control, this fits more with communist ideology. But, and there is a big but on this, wage differentials emerged that don't match ideology, and in, to some extent in some areas were actually greater than the wage differentials in the US. And this is largely due to things like the Stakhanovite movement, where workers who pulled off heroic kind of feats of production and massively broke targets would be then very, very heavily rewarded. And you've also got this kind of party elite that are living very well when others aren't. So there are elements which are ideologically, in terms of, if we want to match it to Marxist ideology, are ideologically sound in terms of it all being state run and collectively held. But there are elements of it where actually there is elements of competition and differential being built in. The military was much better equipped than before, and this would take us back to Stalin's earlier quote, and this is proven by its ability to withstand and then drive back the invasion by Nazi Germany. As I've constantly been referring to, consumer industry is largely being neglected through all of this, and this idea of quality not quantity, and a whole system based on corruption becoming the norm as managers feared the consequences of not meeting targets rather than were worried about the quality of what they were producing. So fear is a very strong motivator, but it isn't necessarily the most fruitful or best motivator in all areas. So we're going to move on to Stalin's other big economic policy, which is collectivization. And again, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of several Russian words through this one. So we see the collectivization is made up of collective farms, or kolkhozy. Now a farmer would join one of these, and in doing so they would give up their land, animals and farming equipment. In exchange, they would earn a wage based on the value of the produce that farm produced that year and managed to sell, and the number of work days they completed. So they kind of go, right, we produced X, you worked Y number of days, so total value of what we produced, you get Y share of it, or whatever it was. The farms were technically independent from the state, but they would have to meet quotas set by the state. They could then sell the rest of the produce at local markets. Later on, particularly post 35, most surplus that was created actually came from peasants' private plots, which where they became allowed to farm, rather than the collective farms out producing the quotas that they were set, because the quotas they were set were ridiculously high. In each area there was an MTS, or machine and tractor station, and collective farms would hire machinery for these in exchange for a share of their produce, which was normally over 20%. The MTS also had a political role. They had political sections within them, and they were used in a way to kind of control the countryside. So you might have a load of collective farms that aren't state run, but the MTS are, and there was 2,500 of these MTSs in total. We also had the development of state farms, the svobkhozy, and these were run on factory lines with each worker or farmer receiving a fixed wage, and they were
run by the state, and they were predominant in developing kind of new land, virgin lands that hadn't been previously farmed. So if you've got an already established farming area, the idea would be to change that into a set of collective farms. If you've got an area that wasn't previously farmed at all, then you would set up the state farms. Now, to set kind of some of the early time frame on this, in 26, only 50% of the expected grain requisition was brought in, and the Communist Party blamed the kulaks for this. In 27, the grain crisis threatened industrial progress, and Stalin urges collectivization at the party congress. In 28, we see continued grain shortages in the cities, and this leads to the use of what is known as the Ural-Siberian method, which is a method that Stalin favoured, which was forced grain requisition. And then in 29, the NEP is ended, and there is extensive use of the Ural-Siberian method. And in December, Stalin launched forced collectivization and announces his intention to annihilate the kulak class. So we see an element of Marxist doctrine in this, with the idea of class war, and the war that the class that has war declared on it is the kulak and Nieperman class. These people who've done well out of these previous economic policies, and they are going to be brutally treated in the next period of Stalinist history. Right, so first of all, this annihilation of the kulak class. Well, they were estimated to make up about 4% of the peasant population, but 15% of peasant households were destroyed. About 150,000 richer peasants were forcibly moved north onto inferior land. Peasants killed livestock and destroyed crops to avoid being labelled as kulaks, because kulaks were coming to a very unpleasant end. So you didn't want to be a kulak. So essentially, and this is one of the real problems with all of this, is that what you've done is you've targeted your best farmers and taken them off the good land, and then either imprisoned them, killed them, or sent them off onto poorer land. Peasants who are doing a reasonably good job then become paranoid that if they're seen as doing too good a job, they'll be classed as kulaks and will meet a similar end. So start deliberately doing worse and killing livestock and destroying crops, so they aren't seen as being successful. And we see this target of 25% collectivization in 1930. Well, by March 1930, 58% of peasant households have been collectivized, and this was partly due to people doing it willingly through the power of propaganda and being forced to do it. We then see a step back because there is massive resistance to this, and Stalin accuses local party members as being dizzy with success. And therefore this unpopular policy that had caused mass opposition was their fault, because they'd gone too quickly and gone beyond what he'd said. Now there's a tiny element of truth in that. He said my aim's 25%, they hit 58% by March. There was massive resistance and disruption in the countryside, and that then led to massive disruption to food supply. So there was a return to voluntary collectivization. Now the number of peasant households remaining collectivized then fell back to 20%. So we can see here Stalin ultimately not hitting the target that he had initially set. So in the period of 1930 to 1941, we see a whole kind of range of things developing. So collectivization, in particular, this idea of dekulakization was a really brutal policy, and we see as many as 10 million kulaks being removed from their farms. Their only real crime actually was success in farming. So in removing them, the Communist Party was removing about 10 million of the Soviet Union's best farmers. To me, this policy just makes no sense, because you kind of go, hey, you're really good at that, you bad person, you've done terrible things, and therefore you are stopping food production by being good at food production. In opposition to these policies, peasants killed about 25 to 30% of the Soviet Union's pigs, cattle, and sheep. So you've got an almost complete wiping out of a quarter to almost a third of livestock in the Soviet Union. These levels never returned to the previous levels until 1953. This leads to a lack of draft animals for work and also natural fertilizer to use in the fields. So a really significant impact. Here we go, massive impact on things like food supply, meat, dairy products, also massive impact on fertilizer, wool, all kinds of things. The stupidly high quotas meant that peasants were often handing over almost all of their grain, and grain levels didn't return to the level they had been prior to collectivization until 1935. Also, you've got party activists who got very excited by the propaganda and the idea of the collective farms, and because they were highly thought of in the party, they were put in charge of things, but they weren't the people with any farming experience. So you had people with no experience of farming running farms, whilst the people who were good at farming being removed. Despite the MTSs being set up, there was not enough tractors, and not helped by the fact that many produced did not work and the lack of transport to actually bring them to the countryside where they were needed. And all this led to this horrendous famine, 1932 to 33, which is one of the worst in Russian history, and though started by a drought in October 31, was largely man-made. It was created by the policies of collectivization. The state was determined to get the necessary grain supply from the peasants in order to feed the cities. The peasants, on the other hand, resisted the demands of these ridiculously high quotas. And so Stalin mobilized the entire party system as if he was going to war, and in his mind he was going to war. He was going to war with the peasants, with the kulaks in particular. And so they were determined to take full quotas of grain from each region. Stalin dispatched leading members of the Politburo to the various parts of the region. If they were to fail, again we'll see this reflected when we look at the purges, then failure to deliver would be seen that they'd been disloyal to the party. And there was full use made of the Red Army and the secret police to force the peasants to hand over their grain. In August 1932, we see the Law of 7/8, which is a nickname after the date it was passed. And this meant that stealing from a collective farm, even if it was just a few ears of corn, gave you a sentence of 10 years hard labour. This was later increased even further to the death penalty. Millions of peasants did not have enough grain or enough food to feed themselves and their families. Between 32 and 34, there was a chronic famine in many areas, in particular, and particularly badly hit were the Ukraine and the Caucasus region. And in these regions, historians estimate that the death toll was around 7 million. From 34 onwards, grain production slowly began to recover, and peasant resistance to collectivization was finally broken. I mean, the human cost to get there was absolutely horrendous. In 35, the government decided to allow peasants to sell produce from their private plots in order to boost the supply of food. Peasants sold milk and eggs and meat, wool, amongst other produce at collective farm markets. And this had an enormously positive impact in terms of agricultural production. However, it does show a movement away from the socialist principles. So collective farms, again, would fit with the idea of communism, where you've got collective farms with people working together and everything is held in collective ownership, and then the profits and everything are taken collectively, and it's all part of what's been done for the greater good. But that wasn't producing enough food to feed the growing towns and cities and the industrial workers. And the only way that they ultimately could get enough food was by saying to the peasants, well, yes, you must work on the collective farm, but you can also have your private plot, and on that you can do what you want and you can sell it and you can make some money. Now, by the end of the 1930s, nearly 3/4 of the nation's milk and meat and nearly half of its wool, vegetables and fruit were coming from these private plots. And this was producing many families with about half of their total income. So half their income was coming through the collective farm, half of it was coming from their private plot. And yes, this means that there is food in the towns and cities, but it can be seen as an ideological failure. On the other hand, if the aim was to collectivise all the farms, by 37, 93% of peasant households have been collectivised. By 41, it was 100%. So in that way, you can say, well, does collectivisation work? Well, in a very simple way, yes. By 41, the farms have all been collectivised. The human misery and death that happens to get there, and the stepping down on ideology, yeah, it gives you a far different picture. So, as I've said, the claim the countryside was successfully collectivised is true to an extent, but the human cost was absolutely mind-blowing. Stalin certainly increased his grip on the countryside. He was always deeply suspicious of the peasants and saw them as counter-revolutionary. But the challenges to collectivization, the challenges in the countryside, were arguably the most significant opposition in the entirety of Stalin's rule. Peasants saw collectivization as a form of second serfdom because they were tied to the collective farm, and it's very reminiscent of how they were tied to the mere and how they were owned by the state or owned by individual nobles. And again, we've got them working for the state, controlled by the state under this. Many peasants left the countryside because of these policies and joined the urban workforce. Now, in a way, actually, that's what the Communist Party wanted. That's what Stalin wanted. He wanted a country of urban workers. They needed the urban workers to grow industry. At first, the policy seems in line with communist ideology, with the collective ownership and the collective work and all that kind of thing. But you can see that this ideology has been abandoned to an extent with the work on private plots. So as I mentioned before, there's a series of different questions you could be asked on this. So you could be asked something about how successful the Soviet leaders were in creating a socialist economy. So do all these different economic policies, so the state capitalism, the war communism, the NEP, 5-year plans and collectivization, do they fit with Marxist or socialist ideas? And there's argument along the way about all of those. You could be asked to what extent did Soviet leaders successfully and effectively develop the economy or create a successful economy in those years? And there's your big headlines on stuff that gets better, like in heavy industry and things like that. You can talk about the failures in terms of what happens in agriculture at various stages, particularly with war communism and collectivization. You've got the constant kind of failure to develop consumerism or consumer goods in a way that kind of very markedly differentiates the Soviet Union away from Western economies in this period. You might get something that's a bit comparative. So, for example, Stalin's 5-year plans were more successful than any of Lenin's economic policies. To what extent do you agree with this statement? So you could get something where you are comparing the policies of Stalin to the policies of Lenin. I think probably something in the lines of the top two is probably more likely. And so one of the bits I would base your notes around in terms of prepping on this is looking at the success and effectiveness of the economic policies, but also on the ideological backbone or structure running through it, and where Marxist or communist ideology is stuck to and where it's diverted from. And remember, this is difficult because Russia, according to Marxist thinking, was actually largely in the feudal stage rather than the capitalist stage when the revolution takes place in 1917. So lots of interesting things to think about in all of that. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been helpful. It's a slightly longer video than normal, but there is so much stuff on the economy in this period. This is part of a series where I'm looking at Tsarist and Communist Russia, hopefully going to go all the way through the A-level history specification for AQA Unit 1H. So if you're studying that,
there's going to be not only this video but lots of other ones that are on this playlist that should be helpful for you in your studies. So please subscribe if you haven't done so already. There's also loads of other history topics on this channel, and also loads of stuff on A-level politics as well. If you think this is useful and you think your classmates or some of the other people you know might find it useful, then please share it with them. If you've enjoyed it, please hit the like, and if you've any questions or queries, then leave those in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching.